Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel Links deck profile. Today we're taking a look at the newly released Buster Blader with its new skill, Emblem of Destruction. So Emblem of Destruction is a really cool skill. This skill can be used if your deck contains 5 or more warrior type monsters with 2600 or 2300 attack and no other monsters with 1300 or more attack. So this restriction is a bit funky. This basically locks us in to only being able to use Buster Blader and Gaia the Fierce Knight and other versions of those cards. So if we had our other Buster Blader monster, which means we could run 3 of Ixis and on Legend, this would be a pretty good spot to be in. But because we have to basically play for Gaia the Fierce Knight, that does make this a little bit awkward. The other issue is that this restricts us from playing any other monsters that have 1300 or more attack. This does lock us out of a lot of interesting options and also means that our low level aggro game is going to be quite weak. We can't run those 1500s, we can't run 1400s even, so we will be relying on our boss monsters more so than some other decks. But the effect requirement none, effect until the end of this turn, all face up monsters with 2300 or more attack on your opponent's field lose 500 attack and become dragon type. Then if it's turn 4 or onward, you can also send one card from your hand and a level 7 monster from your deck to the graveyard once per duel. So the idea is that this will let us beat over anything with our Gaias or our Buster Blader that we otherwise couldn't beat over. So we out a regular Gaia, let's say 2300 attack, and our opponent has a Dragius 2500 attack. We reduce that monster down to 2000, then we can attack over it with our 2300 attack Gaia the Fierce Knight. Now that's fine because right now nobody's playing really any attack modification combat trips. We're not really seeing things like counter pigeons, we're not really seeing the barrier, we're not seeing those sort of cards. So we can kind of get away with this and that kind of being okay. If we do use the Buster Blader, and this would be the same if we had the other Buster Blader as well, we would also get an extra bonus because all of those monsters become dragons, which means we gain an extra 500. So rather than the difference in our attack changing by 500, it would change by effectively 1000 or more if your opponent has more than one boss monster out, because our Buster Bladers gain 500 attack for each dragon. So if your opponent has 2 monsters with 2300 or more attack, effectively we would gain an extra 1000 attack on top of the 500 that they lose, which can actually be really, really good. Unfortunately, because we are relying on our Gaia a lot of the time, it doesn't quite work out like that a lot of the time, but we'll get into that as we talk about the rest of the cards in the deck. The other part of this effect, though, is that if it is turn 4 or onwards, we can send one from our hand to the graveyard to add a level 7 monster from our deck to our graveyard. The idea is that we want to send our Buster Blader to the graveyard so we can use one of our other cards to get it back out of the graveyard and put it into our hand. Now, there is one other small problem with this skill. We can only use this skill if our opponent has monsters with 2300 or more attack. Now, the problem with that is there are a handful of decks that don't play any monsters that meet those requirements. So an example of this would be Harpy Ladies. Unless Harpies do specifically get out the Harpies Pet Dragon, or if they summon out the maximum, we just cannot use this skill at all. So it's basically like we just don't have a skill. And the same goes for Magnum Overlord. Again, unless they summon out their maximum, they are just never going to have monsters that have enough attack, so we just don't get a skill, which is rather disappointing. And then the other deck, which is not seeing as much play, Seven's Axel Row, also plays underneath this card. So there are a lot of decks that just basically turn our skill off, and that can lead to some really poor matchups. But going through the card by card, our legend monster is the Buster Blader. This is the most important card of the deck. Obviously the deck is a Buster Blader deck. So continuous effect, this card gains attack equal to the total number of face-up dragon type monsters on your opponent's field and in their graveyard times 500. So again, this is only usually going to matter when we use our skill to change our opponents to dragons, but if our opponent is playing dragon monsters, this guy can also get really big. And the objective here is to use this card as much as physically possible, but we'll talk about that when we get to the cards that lets us use it. Next up, we have another one of our new monsters, Swift Gaia the Fierce Knight. So this card is the only card in our hand we can normal summon it without tributing, and that is it. So this effect does come up. It doesn't come up too much, because oftentimes we'll just not be able to get our whole hand empty, or we just won't have room to do anything with this, but sometimes this effect does come up. But for the most part, this is going to just be a 2300 attack guy that triggers our effect. We can use it to attack over some other stuff, but when this effect does work and we do get to summon it as an extra body, it can be a really, really good tool to close out games or to try and clean up messy board states. Next up, we're on 2 copies of Karibot, and that's because the deck space in here is quite tight. After playing a bunch with this deck, we weren't actually bricking on high level monsters that much, so I'm actually considering removing the Karibot and maybe including some other cards such as another copy of Hiroshima Warrior or another copy of Siesta Torero. But the idea behind Currybot is it is a little 2-card engine that can plus us if we are bricking and we can get out our tribute monsters. Next up, Hiroshima Warrior. This card is actually really good. So we can shuffle a monster with 0 attack from our graveyard into the deck to choose a face-up warrior type monster on your opponent's field. Your opponent cannot activate trap cards when it declares an attack this turn. So this is a really good way to allow our monsters to attack and your opponent to not be able to respond with a negate attack or a buffered slime or a King's Majesty or any of their other combat tricks. So this is a really good way to just turn your opponent's back row off, which can be really important. And as you might have already noticed, we're not actually playing any back row hate. That's because we can use things like Hiroshima Warrior, we can use things like Ultimate Flag Beast Bold Tricorn to turn off our opponent's back row, then we don't necessarily need to run the back row hate because spell trap space is quite tight here. Also notably, we only have the 1/0 attack monster, that being the Babysitter Goat, but this is in here basically to be used with King's Majesty, but it does double up as a target for Hiroshima Warrior, which has worked quite well for us. Next up, Rising Light Angel Essel. So Essel is quite an important card in here. First off, fueling the graveyard is very important. You can probably see that we are quite graveyard hungry between Siesta Torero, between Talismanic Seal Array, as well as the fact we want to get our monsters in the graveyard such as Currybot and our Buster Blader so that we can use Witness of Dragon Destroy to get it back. So there are a lot of reasons to put cards into the graveyard. But because this is a warrior deck, we're also running Piercing Samurai, which means we can use it in conjunction with Essel to get out a big body and then give that monster Piercing on turn 2, which is still a really good play. If we can get like 1000 damage on that turn 1 and clean up our opponent's board, that sets us up to be in a really good position for the rest of the game. Then we do actually have the Piercing Samurai itself. So if we have 3 or more face-up monsters on our field, we can send the top card of our deck to the graveyard. Choose 1 face-up warrior type monster on our field. If it attacks an position monster, inflict piercing damage. Obviously, we can use this on itself and just attack over stuff with a 1200 Piercer, which is fine. Or we can use it on one of our bigger monsters, such as our Swift Gaia or our Buster Blader. And Buster Blader, again, can get really big. So one play that we have done a couple of times is that we turn our opponent's monsters into dragons, give our Buster Blader the extra 500 attack, then we use our Piercing Samurai to give the Buster Blader the piercing, attack over a defense position monster, and then clear the other monster with a Swift Gaia. And that way we get to wipe out our opponent's board, get rid of the problematic card, and get in for a ton of extra damage. This card does also mill us, and that is another quite heavy theme in this deck. A lot of the cards are milling us, but that's why we're playing so many cards to refill our deck after we have milled. Next up is the MVP for me in this deck. This is Witness of Dragon Destroyer, another brand new card. So during the turn that we normal summon this card, we can send the top 2 cards of our deck to the graveyard to add Buster Blader from our graveyard to our hand. So first off, more milling. So just again, turboing that graveyard as hard as we can, but being able to keep reusing Buster Blader is so important. So being able to keep using this to keep getting Buster Blader back and using it again and again and again gives us even more value. Plus, this is basically just a free +1. There are very few free +1s in this game. Usually they come in the form of like a Currybot or the Aqua Engine. But the better one that we have seen is the Chaos Femtron. And this is kind of like a slightly worse Chaos Femtron, or I suppose, depending how you look at it, it's a much worse Chaos Femtron. But it's still in that same sort of vein and has the same sort of benefit, except we are obviously limited to only using Buster Blader. Next up, Siesta Torero. Siesta Torero is fantastic in this deck. First off, it is a card that we want to have face up, which means it's quite good to have with Piercing Samurai. It's a way to put cards back into our deck. A lot of the time we'll be using this to put Witness Dragon Destroy back into our deck, so we can keep reusing, again, all of our cards again and again and again. As well as flipping cards face down can be really useful. First, it will let us attack over any problematic monsters that are quite high attack. Second, we can set up a big Piercing Samurai turn. If we're able to flip something face down, then attack over it with that or with another monster. It's especially good against decks that have low defense boss monsters, such as Royal Rebels and such as Cyberse, which are both very heavily used in the meta right now. Siesta Torero, fantastic card. Then we have the Bolt Tricorn. So if we have no other monsters on our field, we can send top effect to the graveyard. 1 face down spell or trap on your opponent's field cannot be activated until the end of their next turn. So just a fantastic card. Any deck that really can use this card probably should. Being able to turn off your opponent's back row is really good. And again, it does mill us again, which a lot of our cards want to be milled. So that's just works fantastically. As well as it will stop your opponent's spell cards from being used in the following turn as well, which is very good. Then we're on 2 copies of regular Gaia. So you basically have to play at least 1 copy of regular Gaia, and then whether or not you play 2 or 3 comes down to whether or not you want the limit 3 cards. You have to play a minimum of 1 Swift Gaia because we need to hit 5 monsters with the correct attack. So that's going to be a Buster Blader and then 4 other Gaias. So we have to run at least 1 Swift Gaia. Now, if you want to play more limit 3 cards, we could cut this down to 1. But for me personally, I'm quite happy running just the King's Majesty, and so I've got a 2-2 split. The reason we've gone for the King's Majesty is because this deck has a real big weakness to maximum decks. So we've got this in here to help stave off Magnum Overlord, as well as to help deal with other big maximum threats such as Yggdrago. So King's Majesty is just fantastic, and it's never dead in any matchup. This card is always useful against something. Then we have the Babysitter Goat. Again, this is in here just to be used with King's Majesty, as well as Urashima Warrior. But also, this card does have quite nice defense, which does work quite nicely against Mirror Innovator. Then for our Legend spell, we are on Tribute to the Doomed. Tribute to the Doomed is a really, really strong spell card. First off, this does out maximums, which again is going to be our deck's major weakness. Second, we can just pop a face down defense position monster and make our third attack for the turn a direct attack, which can be really, really good. We could swap this for any of the other legends. Realistically, some people are playing the Warrior Returning Alive, which again is really, really good in here. But I don't like the idea of not having a consistent out to maximum monsters, which is why I personally have gone with Tribute to the Doomed. But I do think that the Warrior Returning Alive or even Sword and Shield would be fantastic options. Just depends how safe you want to be and how high roll you want to play the deck. Next up, we're on 3 copies of Talismanic Seal Array. So again, we are putting a lot of cards into our graveyard, so we want a lot of ways to put those cards back. Talismanic Seal Array is a great way to just get damage in against any deck, but is especially good against maximum monsters. The only downside can be that if your opponent summons out their Worm Excavator, that thing can easily reach 5,000 attack. Talismanic Seal Array can pump that down to 3,000, and then we very specifically need our Buster Blader plus our skill to be able to out it, which means if our opponent has many more cards than 5 cards in their hand, it still can get a bit problematic, which is why, again, Tribute to the Doom becomes so valuable. Now, initially, we were only playing 2 copies of Talismanic Seal Array, and that is because we were playing the trap card Forever Freeze. But in testing, we didn't go up against Royal Rebels that much, so we ended up taking Forever Freeze out of the list. But I think if you're expecting to run into Royal Rebels, if the meta is very Royal Rebel heavy, our deck has to kind of commit a lot to board to really get anything done, so Forever Freeze is a must to do those big, annoying Doom Metal plays. But if we're not expecting to see the Royal Rebels, again, the third TSA is what we've gone with, and it's been really good for us so far. Then for the traps, Negate Attack, again, best trap in the game, it's absolutely fantastic. Specifically can stop maximums, but it also stops everything else. And the same for King's Majesty, again, does work on maximums, but also does work on everything else, so really, really important trap cards. And then we have the Buffered Slime, which is good for that everything else. Buffered Slime is, again, a mandatory inclusion in pretty much every deck right now. It can just stop you from losing the game. And I don't really think I need to explain why this card is good. All 3 of these trap cards are absolutely fantastic, and anytime we can get away with using a King's Majesty, I will find a way to use it, and it just seems to work really well in this deck specifically. So, let's talk about this deck's matchups. We have a 100% win rate against Harpies, but Harpies is not one of the strongest decks in the meta right now. Our matchup against Overlord did end up going in our favor, but not very much. It's probably about 60-40 in our favor. So Overlord is still a bit of a problem, even though we have all of these outs to Overlord. That deck can still just steal games out of nowhere. If they have a lot of back row hate, they can just pop your trap cards and then kill you anyway. In terms of machines, we lost 100% of the machine games that we played, which is disappointing, but that is arguably the best deck right now, so that's kind of fine. And interestingly, Cyberse is another deck we did play against an absolute ton, and the Cyberse matchup actually went a little bit towards our favor. I think it ended up being about 55-45 to the Buster Blader deck, which was very, very surprising. I was expecting the Cyberse deck to absolutely destroy us, but I think just having this many outs to Yggdrago really did help out the deck. But this deck will still get eaten alive by some specific decks. Royal Rebel is, like we said before, going to absolutely destroy us. We don't really have any ways to get damage in outside of summoning a couple of bosses and then like a Piercing Samurai and then using that to overwhelm our opponent. But by having 3 attack position monsters, we're just going to get blown out by the Doom Metal, which can be a little bit problematic. Overall, I would say this deck doesn't feel overly strong. It's not terrible. It's not necessarily bad, but it's not super strong. I think comparing this to the 3 best decks right now, which I would consider to be Machine, Cyberse, and Royal Rebel, this deck is going to lose a lot more games against those decks than it's going to win, typically. Now, again, I think this deck can take games off of any deck. It's just, will it take those games more consistently? I don't think so, realistically. This is still an okay deck, and I do think this deck is very, very fun. And I think that is a big takeaway for me, is that if I'm losing with a deck and still having a good time, then for me, that is a really fun deck. And I've really enjoyed playing this deck. I think the way that its pieces kind of come together does feel really nice. Even if it doesn't always result in a win, I can still have a great time playing this deck. But let's fire in some replays so I can show you what I've been talking about.
参ります。着工ラッシュデュエル。誇りにかけてラッシュデュエル。シュデュエル。 シュデュエル ラッシュデュエル ラッシュデュエル